It's mainly the scriptures. Anyway, are we ready? We're starting. Well, welcome everybody tonight. We've had a few little issues here on our end of things, not on the World Wide Web of things, but we appreciate. Usually it's the other way around. Usually it's the internet that's causing trouble. Tonight it was more of a hardware issue or what have you. But anyway, welcome. Happy New Year to everyone. Happy New Year to all of you who joined us out tonight, who kind of weathered the weather and the traffic and are joining us out here on this dark January evening, and the first service of 2023. So it's exciting to be here with you. If you're joining us online, we appreciate you doing so. Unfortunately, conflict is something that's been a part of the church since the very beginning, has it not? We've noticed that. What are some examples? And we're kind of jumping right in, head first into our Bible study, picking up where we left off, Acts chapter 21. Tonight's title of this lesson, as we're looking at verses 17 to 26, is conflict resolution. And when I'm talking about conflict, we see that often happen in the church, in our lives personally, at work, anywhere where there's people, right? And what are some examples of conflict that we've recently, or we've already seen, I should say, in the book of Acts? If you kind of remember back, what are some examples, or can you think of any examples of conflict that we've seen in the book of Acts?
Paul and Barnabas.
Okay, Paul and Barnabas. There was some disagreement over Mark and that whole situation is what you're talking about? Yeah, so there's been that conflict, some personal disagreement there. Any others?
Well, conflict between the people Paul was preaching to and the gospel.
Yeah, people conflicted with the gospel. That's been a real big issue, right? Coming up against Judaism, calling Judaism out. People who were staunch followers of Judaism really, lashing out at Paul as if he were as if he were blaspheming the name of God. So we've seen that happen. Any other examples? We got my main student over here. He's getting them all.
There was a conflict of the woman who practiced witchcraft or something, and then someone got mad because Paul didn't like it because she was declaring who Paul was.
Yeah, calling out his name and stuff. The demon-possessed person.
Yeah.
There's been some conflicts there. How about, remember way back, there was this conflict because the church was growing and it was growing kind of rapidly, that the apostles couldn't keep up with, everything that had to be kept up with. So they said, people were saying, y'all aren't taking care of us. We aren't getting the food we need. And, tables are not being taken care of. The food wasn't being distributed as it should have been. The widows weren't being cared for. There was conflict there. And that's when they had to come up with the deacons to help. That was Acts. I think it was chapter 6 where they were talking about that.
There was conflict in the very beginning whether Jesus really rose.
Yeah, the whole idea of him being real and the resurrection. One of the conflicts that seems to keep coming up throughout the book of Acts is right in the middle of the church. This conflict between Jews that are following the Messiah, so converted Jews, and Gentile followers of Jesus, right? So you have Jews that are following Jesus now. They've converted over to Christianity. And you have Gentiles that are converted over to Christianity. And there's this conflict. And you can imagine what the conflict's about, right? It's about keeping of the law. Mm-hmm. And so Paul has been out there ever since. Remember, there was a whole, y'all remember back, I think it was Acts chapter 12, I think it was. I can't remember exactly, but it's Acts chapter 12, I believe, where they had the Council of Jerusalem, and they decided, okay, this is what we're gonna resolve. This is what we're gonna do. We're not gonna make the Jews, circumcise their children and the grown men be circumcised and all that kind of stuff. We're not gonna make them do all that. We're not gonna make them, do these kind of things or keep to the dietary law. We just want them to do 4 things or not do 4 things, right? And they talk about, abstaining from, foods offered to idols, if they could all know that possible. Not committing adultery, or idolatry, so not worshiping idols. There was something about the blood in the meat, not eating the blood, not consuming the blood. So that was one of the things there was. Like 4 different things they said that we want you to keep away from. Well, they said, you don't have to keep the law except for these 4 things, right? These are the 4 things we are non-negotiable, kind of things. And so Paul's out there, preaching and telling these Gentiles, hey, you don't have to be circumcised, you're free from the law, you don't have to do that. Well, he was trying to reach them with this new gospel, with the gospel of grace. Something that wasn't before, something that hadn't been a part of the Jewish culture before, because Jesus brought this in. So he's teaching that. Well, while he's doing that, you got this whole group of people back at Jerusalem. The church is still growing, right? That's where James is. That's where Peter is. That's where all the other elders and apostles are. And the church is growing. And it's just getting larger and larger. The church of Jerusalem is getting larger and larger and larger. And they're hearing about what Paul is doing, but they're not getting the whole story. And so all they are seeing is Paul is throwing contempt for the law of Moses. He's kind of downplaying the law of Moses and disrespecting it. And so they're not too happy with Paul. But I don't think they really know Paul, know what he's all about. And I say they, I'm talking about the majority of the church, the majority of the believers there. Not necessarily the leadership, but the congregation, if you will. They were not too happy with Paul. And so that's where we're going to pick the story up tonight as we get to 17 to 26. Paul comes back to Jerusalem and he walks into like a firestorm. He walks back into a mess. And this is in Acts chapter 21, verses 17 to 26. And this is kind of what takes place. So we're going to read these verses, and then we're going to talk about how do we deal with conflict. Maybe look at what Paul did, talk about how we can deal with conflict when it arises in our own lives, especially when it arises in the church, and what should we do about it, okay?
There's still a conflict between legalism and grace.
Exactly.
Just today.
Even today. Exactly, you're right. And that's just one example, right? It's just one example of it, but it is a large example in many mainstream religions anyway. All right, let's go to read verses 17 to verse 26. It says, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And on the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When he had greeted them, he told them in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple and to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. All right, so first of all, Paul comes into this situation. He has no idea, this is all going on. He has no idea that there are a bunch of people there, a lot of Jewish believers now, that do not like him. Okay, they look at him with contempt, thinking that he is, throwing contempt onto Moses and the law, disrespecting it. And so the law of Moses was a big deal to the Jewish people. It was sacred. It was the Holy Grail. If there was any, it's just the way they looked at it. And for somebody to come and say, it doesn't really matter, or you don't have to keep it, you don't have to follow it, was just not something they wanted to hear. Now, was Paul right in what he was saying? Yes, he was right in what he was saying, but he didn't really say that. He didn't come out and say, you don't have to keep the law, you don't have to do these things. He was just saying, you've been free from this. This is God, Christ has made you free. And that's what he was telling the Jews who were converting while he was preaching. There were many of them that were accepting his faith and accepting his message. Of course, like Pat pointed out a few minutes ago, there were many who didn't accept it, right? And those were the ones who were always wanting to lynch him, and string him up. So he walked into this mess, not knowing that there was a conflict, and not knowing that this was going to, that there would be people who would, didn't like him and didn't want to see him there, weren't welcome. He thought he'd be welcomed back with, open arms, loving arms. He'd be celebrated as like a champion. He'd just been this missionary going out on all these journeys, 3 times going out, and seeing lives changed, and ministries started and planted, churches planted, the gospel taken to the regions beyond, and yet he didn't get that kind of welcome when he came back, at least not to the public. So how did he respond to it? How was this conflict resolved among Paul and the other leaders? Because it wasn't the leaders, was it? They gladly received him. They were excited. They were glorifying the Lord with all that he had done and what all had been done. But James made it clear, hey, we've got a problem, and we need to address it now. This is very important that we recognize that they didn't ignore it, right? Conflict does not need to be ignored. That's not a way to resolve conflict. You ever seen a couple that try to ignore their conflict with each other, husband and wife, they got an issue with each other, and they just ignore it? What happens? Usually there's a barrier get built up, you get a distance between each other, and before long you're just 2 grown people living in the same house, cohabitating. You don't have a relationship. Marriage is meant to, work things out. Our salvation is meant to work things out. This relationship we have with God is meant to work things out. We're not to ignore a situation where we have an issue between us and the Lord, between us and our spouse, or between us and our brothers and sisters in Christ. If there's a conflict, then we need to resolve it. But how do we resolve it? Well, I want you to notice some things that Paul did. First of all, Paul was fair about the whole matter. Now, when I say fair, I say he was fair to everybody else. Not necessarily to himself in a lot of ways. Because he could have lashed out, right, in anger. He could have said, what in the world? I mean, I'm the one out there risking my life and limb, right? I'm the one that's being lynched up every other week. People are running me out of towns and stuff. I'm out there going out there and taking the gospel out and going out into some dangerous areas. I'm putting my life at risk so that others may believe. And you guys here in Jerusalem, and you're all like, you want to treat me like this when I come back? How many of you remember, and I wasn't around, obviously, I was just being born, but, when the guys came back from Vietnam, how many of you remember hearing about how they were mistreated? The soldiers came back, and disrespected. Now, You can say what you want about what happened over there and how things went down. I talked to some guys that were in that fought in Vietnam. I've heard some of their stories and such. And whether it's true or embellished or what, I don't know. But I will say, it's not fair to be treated like they were treated. Okay? It wasn't fair for them to be treated like that. Since then, I think the world has learned lessons, and now we kind of celebrate our soldiers when they return from battle. And they're more of a celebrated thing. And, again, maybe it was just a lot of things happening over there, and the way the media spend everything, I don't know. Because, again, I wasn't alive. I was baby, if anything. But this is kind of how Paul was treated when he got back. He thought he would be treated with, like, a celebratory manner, and people would be excited, but he was saying, hey, Paul, we got to work something out. You got to hold it down. We don't even need them to know you're here yet. They're going to know. They're going to figure it out. We're going to all get together. And when we do, we need to have this worked out ahead of time, because this conflict is not going to, we can't ignore it. So, he didn't become angry. He didn't become bitter about it. He didn't lash out. He could have had hard feelings. He could have been offended by it all. He could have said, I'm done with all of you. He kind of had said that kind of thing before, had he not? He kind of gotten done with people before, and he could have gotten that way again. But what he did instead, and I say, there's one thing that I learned from going to family life events when they were talking about husbands and wives and the relationships between married couples. They talk something called fighting fair. And fighting fair is not meeting in the middle or in the middle ground. Fighting fair is when you go over to the other person's side and you see it from their perspective. It's meeting that person on their side and seeing what they're seeing, what they're talking about. And so what Paul did is he literally went to the other person's side and he tried to see from their perspective what the issue was. And so that's how he was kind of more than fair in this whole idea is he crossed over to the enemy line, if you will, and tried to get a different perspective on the whole issue. So he was fair about it, but also he was flexible. And flexibility is key when it comes to resolving conflict. If we're not flexible, then chances are relationships will be broken. After hearing out James, Paul humbly consents to the advice of the elders. Now, this whole thing, what James said, the elders and James have been talking about it. They came up with this plan. They worked it out ahead of time. They knew Paul was coming. They knew this was going to happen. And, as all good leadership does, they proactively came up with a plan versus reactively coming up with a solution. They said, hey, we got to do something. So when Paul showed up, they said, listen, we got these 4 guys that have taken a vow. What we want you to do is join them. So whenever their day of separation comes, when their vow is over, you can go to the sacrifice into the temple, announce to the priest that the vow is over, so that these days, days of purification have begun, which is 7 days after the vow is ended. So you announce to that priest, they have 7 days to get ready for the sacrifice that takes place to end the vow. Okay? There's also time at the end of that where you'll shave your head. During that time, the sacrifice is made. So this all goes back to Numbers chapter 6, the vow that we're talking about taking as a Nazirite vow. The whole idea of not touching anything dead, not drinking the grape juice or the grapevines or the grapes or touching it or anything like that. Can't go to any funerals, can't be around any dead people, can't do anything, and can't cut your hair. Okay, so that is kind of the Nazirite vow in a nutshell. So they were already in that vow, whether it be for 30 days or for 45 days or however long this vow was taken, they were already in it. Paul had to join them in the vow. Then the second part of it was he had to help cover the expense of the vow. So the expense of it would be the sacrificing part. Because at the sacrifice, there was to be a male lamb, 1 year old, without blemish, as a burnt offering. there was to be another ewe lamb, a 1-year-old, to be sacrificed. And there was to be a ram, 1-year-old, without blemish, to be sacrificed as a peace offering. So the burnt offering, a wave offering, and a peace offering. And then they were to bring a basket of unleavened bread cakes to be brought to the priest as well as part of the sacrifice, and a portion of wine that will be drank. And so they would bring that to, after the vow is ended, you have the 7-day purification process they go through, and then after the 7 days, they go into the temple and meet with the priest, bring the lambs, the ram, the ewe lamb. They bring all the animals, the basket of bread, the wine. The priest does his thing. He puts the burnt offering, the lamb on the burnt offering, and they cut the person's hair, take part of the hair, put it in the fire underneath the burnt offering, take part of that offering, wave it, put it in the hands of those that are ending the vow, put it in their hands. The priest waves the offering before the Lord, and they drink the wine, and the sacrifice is ended, and their vow is over. So it's quite a commotion. I mean, it's not like you do this and get away with it and no one's going to see it, right? It's like, this is going to be a big deal. It's going to be a lot of stuff happening. It's going to be a lot of ritual, ceremonial. I mean, you don't just come in and say, we've taken a vow, we're going to end it, days of purification have begun. You announce to the priest. It's a public thing. The elders were saying, we're going to make this as public as possible. The most visible thing you can do. And we're going to make you participate in it. You put your own skin in the game, right? You've got to put money into it. You've got to have your head shaven. You've got to do all this stuff. Why? Because we think, it's going to gain you some interest into God's kingdom, because it's going to give you salvation, or God's going to give you favor. No, it wasn't about God. The Jews knew, the elders knew that. James knew that. Why did he do all that? What was all that for?
So everybody would accept it.
So the people would see it, right? So all these that were showing this said, or were thinking at least, and many of them were doing more than thinking it, were saying it, because how else would the elders know? They had been hearing it. They did all that so that it would appease the Jews, so that those Jewish believers would see that Paul was not someone who disregarded the law of Moses, but had respect for the law of Moses, and was actually somebody who would follow the law of Moses. And Paul did it, knowing good and well, it wasn't for his own faith, it wasn't for his own relationship with God, but he did it so that he might win them. Remember later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he's talking to the Corinthian people. He said, I became all things for all men that I might win some. He said, to the Jew, I became a Jew so that I might win the Jews. To the Gentiles, I became a Gentile so that I might win. He said, I did all so I can win some. In other words, he said, and we're going to get to that in just a minute when I talk about the next thing you can do. But flexibility is key. You've got to be flexible. Sometimes, though, I say the church, but I'm saying mostly it's the people, us as believers, can become a lot more like plastic. You know what plastic is, in its natural state, is rigid and it's inflexible, right? You can't just grab a piece of plastic and bend it. Because what happens if you start trying to bend plastic? Eventually, it'll snap, it'll break, right? But you expose that plastic to the right amount of heat, and what happens? It'll become pliable, and you can shape it, and you can bend it, and you can turn it. The plastic does not change. It's still plastic, but it's able to move about. When you take the heat away, then it returns to that rigid state again. It becomes more like Play-Doh, if you will. While in this pliable state, the inherent nature of the plastic hasn't changed. The molecules just become weakened by the heat. Well, Paul was like that heat, his ministry was like that heat to the church. It was heating up, and it was beginning to kind of cause that church to have to change to mold. The church needed to be flexible. These people needed to be flexible when it comes to the changes that were happening in the church. And yet, Paul was the one, in order to resolve the conflict, Paul was the one who became flexible. Now, when you think about your approach to the church, whether that be mission or outreach events or interactions with new members or visitors, what role does Paul's model of flexibility take into your consideration? How can you take that into consideration with your own, approach to ministry? What do you think are some things that we can do when it comes to our own church, when it comes to being flexible? Anything?
Be more accepting of people that think a little different than you, as long as it doesn't conflict the gospel.
Right, right.
You at least have to be open to ideas and listen to them, and even not in a bad way, but debate,
Yeah,
why an idea might be better or not.
right,
I
right.
used to have a coworker a long time ago. He and I, people would hear us, they think we were arguing, but he and I would go back and forth on each of our opinions. But he and I knew at the end that either we would figure out that his was right, mine were right, or both were a way to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
We weren't arguing. We were having fun trying to get to a thing that we both were happy with.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't an argument. It was just a friendly debate, so we just wanted to get the right answer.
Yeah.
But
When you have
sometimes
two conflicting ideas and both of you won't move, then it's hard to get anywhere, right? And too often the church is made up of people that have paradigms that they're set on that they won't move from. We've always done it this way. This is the way we've always done things. And we won't change. Well, I'm not saying change for change's sake is a good thing, but if we're not flexible, then the church can become broken. And certainly Paul was not wanting the church to become broken. He didn't want to be the cause of a fragmented church. He wanted to do everything he could to bring unity to the church. That's why he would later on say to the Ephesians, I do everything in the spirit in the spirit of unity to bring about the bond of peace. It's about bringing together the church, and that's what he was trying to do.
and that's almost in my mind harder for small churches, because
Oh yeah.
when there's only a few of you and you have been used to doing it a certain way for the past, even just 2 years or 3 years, that's just not how you do it. And
Yeah.
other people just might not like it, or they might have another idea, and we want to do it because we've done it that way.
Unfortunately, I think many churches stay small because they won't become flexible.
Right, because you're not welcoming of other people's opinions, so you're not welcoming of them.
Now, when I say be fair, be flexible, it's not meaning you have to get away from your convictions, because Paul certainly wasn't doing that. He was firm, okay? And that's the final thing you got to do. You got to stay firm with your convictions. Now, understand this, and I will say this, or I should say, it is possible to be firm and fair, and yet, or I should say, it is possible to be flexible and fair, and yet remain firm in your convictions. In other words, you can have both. You can do it all. See, James knew Paul didn't have any issue with the law, other than he knew what the law was for. He knew the purpose of the law, and he knew what Christ did for the law. The law pointed to Christ, and Christ had fulfilled it. James knew that Paul knew that. They all knew that. James also knew that Paul wasn't going to relent to his conviction about freedom from the law. He wasn't going to go to say that he wasn't going to start telling people, oh, we must keep the law in order to be saved. He wasn't going to do that. James knew that, and Paul knew that. So they knew that was taking place. And they also knew that, they also all knew what they had decided back at the Jerusalem Council. They knew what they had decided back then, and that's why they decided that, to make like a compromise with the Gentile people. So, but Paul was sensitive to the Jews who were staunch followers of the law, those who were still kind of, leaning toward, the law. He was sensitive to that, because he looked at them as the weaker brother. He looked at them as though they were the ones that needed to grow. They were the ones that needed to change. They were the ones that need to kind of be matured. And so he didn't judge them or condemn them for that situation. He was rather sensitive to it. But Paul also realized that the Jews in the church at Jerusalem didn't know the whole story. They didn't know what he had preached, what he was actually preaching. They didn't know how he had been talking to Jew and Gentile alike in the message that he was preaching to them. So, and remember, Paul wasn't opposed to these kind of customs. Because not too long ago, Paul left from Caesarea, and remember he was leaving there, I think he was leaving Corinth and going back to Jerusalem on his third missionary journey head back to Jerusalem, and he said he had to shave his head because he had taken a vow. So these customs were not something he was opposed to. They were not something outside of his convictions. He was not it wasn't in opposition to his faith and to his beliefs. They were something as a normal part of his lifetime. But those things he looked at were just customs. They were just traditions. They were ceremonial. They weren't necessary to his relationship with God. And so we can remain flexible when it comes to customs and traditions and certain ceremonies and things like this, but we can't be flexible on our convictions and on the truth of the faith of our gospel. We cannot be flexible on that. We have to stand firm on our beliefs.
You kind of picture Paul that he would have to maybe correct them in the law because he knew the law. So they might not know the law as good as he does.
Right.
And then turn right around and say, now that you understand what the law is, now I got to show you what grace is.
Right.
I can just see him having to do both. Because
Exactly.
he knew the law.
Yeah, exactly. You're not talking about somebody who was unlearned. I mean, he was probably one of the more intelligent people in the whole group, you know. And, I mean, it's clear. I mean, there's no way that he wouldn't have been considering what God used him to do and how he, as much of the Bible that God used him to write. So, I want to think of a real-life example today where this is played out. Where you see people who are flexible when it comes to customs and traditions and things like that, but when it comes to their faith or their convictions, they stand firm on it. Can you think of any real-life examples of that?
Well, the question I asked myself, because you said earlier that Paul was, that the traditions that he practiced didn't conflict, but they weren't necessary for his relationship with the Lord.
Right.
And so what immediately pops into my brain, okay, so what is necessary for my relationship with the Lord? And the things that I thought of are prayer, Bible study, and worship.
Yeah, yeah.
And so some might say how you worship might be detrimental, but it's not how I worship, it's just that I worship.
Amen.
That is important.
And worship is much more than just like singing with a praise band or with a piano or organ. How you're doing it is not necessarily worship, right?
Right.
It's just a platform or a mechanism by which I can worship. I can worship nailing the hammer, you know,
Right.
in the board, you know. I can worship, you know, plowing a garden, and worship, you know, in the middle of a group of people, you know, in prayer or singing a song. So, I mean, it's not about how it's done, and that's a very good example. Very good.
I know that was your point, but drums is one of those sticky points
Yeah.
in worship.
Yeah, and again, that's more of a tradition, it's more of a, you know, a custom or a culture thing. And so what I was getting at is, the example I was thinking of is missionaries. You know, missionaries go into a sometimes very radically different culture, right? I mean, sometimes it's diets are different, sometimes it's, you know, the way they worship is different. Talk about the way they worship.
The environment's almost always different because rarely do missionaries get to go to America.
Yeah. Mode of travel, you know, how they talk, how they interact with each other. And so you have to kind of you have to kind of follow a lot of these customs if you want to build relationships with the people you're trying to present the gospel to. You're not changing your convictions, but you're changing your customs. And like I heard this one guy talk, he was ministering among the people in Afghanistan. And he was like ministering to them. This was during the time of the Russian-Afghanistan war, when the Russians were at war with Afghanistan, the Afghanis. And he was like working in a lot of these like war camps where the refugees would come out of Afghanistan into another country. I forget what country he was working in. But he would go and meet with them, and they would be living in these tents, and he would providing them aid and stuff like that, and helping them, tending to them, providing food for them and things like that. But then he would get to talk to him about the Lord and stuff. Well, he said when they had communion over there, they drank real wine. It wasn't grape juice, they drank real wine. Because in their mind, that's what it says. The Bible says wine. So they drank wine. And that's what they had, and that's what they drank. He said, we don't go over there and say, no, it's supposed to be grape juice, you're supposed to drink grape juice. He said, we didn't do that. We just drank what they drank. That's what we did. And so that's one of those customs. You know, it's just something that you do because it's what everybody's doing to appease the people you're trying to build that relationship with. It's not that you're going against, you know, something that's detrimental to your salvation, but you're not changing on that point. But you're going to do certain customs or follow certain customs. And missionaries are a prime example of having to follow those traditions or customs. And that's kind of what Paul was doing. And so we see how he worked out that conflict. And it was really one-sided because, as we're going to see next week, it doesn't always work out. Right? It doesn't always work out like you want it to. But needless to say, Paul is a man with a target on his head. Okay, now that we learn about him throughout the book of Acts, you're going to go back and you're going to read all the other parts of his letters, and you're going to start saying, well, I know why he's taught like that. I know why he says things like that. Because he was a man that was like a hunted man, just about his entire ministry once he, turned to faith in Christ. Let's wrap it up. So, when I said conflict has always been a reality for the church, I think we can all agree with that. But I will say something now that maybe you will believe, or maybe you will agree with me, and that is, I believe conflict is always going to be a thing, even for now until the Lord comes back. I think it's always going to be. And why do I think that? Because we're people, and we're broken people. And we just have a way of messing stuff up. I mean, the two people that got put in the world when everything was perfect messed it up. Okay? And if they could mess it up when everything was perfect, now that everything isn't perfect, we're going to mess stuff up. And not that we should seek to do that, but I say that to say there's going to be conflict. But when it comes, let's not ignore it, but let's seek a way of resolving it. And how do we respond to it will determine if the church grows or if it becomes fragmented. We see a lot of churches end up being broken. And maybe they're broken apart. You see churches fall apart, church splits. Sometimes the church is broken, but it stays together. And that's when you see churches that they're not going anywhere. And certainly you don't want that to happen. You want a church that grows. You want each person to be growing. And so our response is critical to that. And how can we respond? Well, we can try to see it from the other person's perspective of what's going on, rather than becoming offensive or defensive about it. Rather than get offended, try to be fair and seeing it from a different perspective. We can be as flexible as much as possible, even if that means that we are the ones that have to, compromise. Like Paul said, I became all things that I might win some. But we must be firm in our convictions. can't give in on what, the core of our faith. And that is absolutely a non-negotiable. And so I guarantee you, if it would have been presented any other way to Paul, saying, Paul, you have to start observing the law, in order for you to be a follower of God, or a Christian. Remember, James and the elders, that was just Christians trying to tell another Christian how to be a better Christian. That's all it was. And they wouldn't tell him something that wasn't going to help him be a better person. So that's what we should all be. Just Christians trying to help each other be better Christians. All right, well, we're going to close out tonight with some prayer time. And if you have prayer requests you'd like to share with us, we would love to be able to take those prayer requests and pray with you with them. If you have a prayer request online, you can share it with us on our website or on the comment section below the video, and we will eventually get those prayed for. And we appreciate you joining us. But until the next time, may the Lord bless you always. And Happy New Year.